Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the current director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University on behalf of the Harriman Institute and the Salzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. It is a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's uh, uh, webinar, a virtual book launch, whatever you want to call it, that's featuring a panel discussion about this new book, Exit from Hegemony, which I've co-authored with Dan Nexon. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Emma Ashford, who's a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute, here on the panel today as well. We're simultaneously operating out of Zoom, and there is a Zoom Q&A function. And so I would ask people who have questions to use that function, and we will collect questions. Also, we're going out on Facebook Live. And again, we encourage those of you watching this stream via Facebook to ask questions via the chat, and those will be streamed to us. So the event will go about an hour today from 12 to 1. The format is the following. Dan will kick off with a brief overview, and he has also some slides that he will virtually share about the book and its major arguments. I'll then follow up with a few minutes about, given that this is a co-sponsored Harriman Institute event, how this argument applies to Russia and Russian foreign policy and Russian views of international order. And then we'll turn over to Emma for some commentary and critique, and then we'll open it up for some discussion and your questions. So thanks again to everyone for having us with you in your lunch hour. And Dan, why don't you kick things off with the main arguments from Exit from Hegemony.
All right. Well, welcome to our PowerPoint, the PowerPoint section of our presentation. I'm going to mostly be talking, but I will encourage Alex to chime in, particularly on Russia Matters as I continue. This is, of course, the banner for our book, which is now out with Oxford University Press, and I'm super excited that Emma's agreed to join us and hopefully rake us over the coals some, because that makes it much more interesting. So I'm going to start out by talking about the kind of key takeaways of the book. And I won't be going into all of these in detail, but this is kind of the bottom line if you read the book, what we want you to know. The first is that the US is no longer the global hegemonic power that it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And it's not coming back. The question now is not so much, can we re-achieve this stature, or can the US re-achieve this stature, but is the scope of US influence, including the fate of its core system, roughly the alliance networks composed of the advanced industrialized democracies that it built during the Cold War. So the question is not, can it run the world anymore? The United States can't do it. The question is whether or not it can maintain this kind of core hegemonic system that, in our view, although some may disagree, has served the United States quite well. Now, we won't have much to say about this in the talk proper, but we'll underscore the fact that Trump, in our view, is a symptom and an accelerant, but not a cause, fundamentally, of US hegemonic decline by focusing on structural dynamics. That is, dynamics rooted in already realized changes in the global economy that are driving what we call hegemonic unraveling. Now, as Alex mentioned, because this is a Harriman talk, he'll discuss some Russia-specific aspects of the dynamics we highlight. Russia plays different parts in the processes that are unraveling US leadership with varying degrees of success. So this is, I'll be talking a lot about China, but this is also a story about Russia. It's a story about regional powers. It's a story about other dynamics at work. All right. So if we were to start in the late 1990s and the early 2000s and think about the position of the United States, the consensus would be that the United States strode the world like a colossus. In the late 90s, Madeleine Albright famously called the US the indispensable nation. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this kind of discussion in the 1990s about overweening US power into the early 2000s is this was very different than what was predicted with the end of the Cold War by many scholars and observers, which was the world was rapidly entering a period of multipolarity, of multiple competing great powers, including the United States, Germany, Japan, and Russia. But it also marked a difference from the anxieties about US decline that dominated in the middle of the 1980s. Then many scholars believed that we were entering a post-hegemonic world, or a world in which the United States was in great decline. So the Bretton Woods system had collapsed in the 1970s. Germany and Japan were on the rise economically. And the USSR, according to most observers, had successfully asserted itself and was going to have a permanent seat at the table as one of the two superpowers. In the mid-1980s, Paul Kennedy published The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers and lent historical weight to the idea that the US was overextended, fiscally imbalanced, neglecting domestic priorities, and needed to successfully adjust to these realities while getting its allies to pick up more of the defense burden, or else it would go the way of the Spanish Habsburgs and other sort of falling great powers of the past. Moreover, straight-line projections showed that Japan would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy sometime in the 1990s. Pundits and scholars argued that the US needed to learn from superior Japanese business and economic policy. I took a course with Ezra Vogel, who wrote The Japan That Can Say No. I'm sorry, the Japan is number one, which argued precisely that if we didn't learn from their superior managerial techniques, their superior industrial policy, then the United States would not be competitive. While Japanese authors wrote about US bullying on matters of burden sharing and trade policy and argued that the United States and Japan would still soon come to blows in what we would now call a hegemonic, at least political conflict. Now, our argument, and this is the argument actually of the first chapter of the book, is that we can learn a great deal about what's happening now and why this time is different by looking at why these kinds of predictions were wrong. So what happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s that changed the story from one of US decline to one of US preponderance? Well, Japan entered its lost decade, and whether this was driven by problems with its political economy related to the bursting of the real estate bubble, or whether or not it was underlyingly driven by demographic changes in the aging of Japan is something that economists debate about. Nonetheless, Japanese growth stalled out. Straight line projections did not happen, while the US itself experienced unexpectedly strong growth in the 1990s, fueled by the technology boom. Moreover, nationalist uprisings helped to bring down the Soviet outer empire, and then in 1991, the USSR itself. This left the United States alone at the top solely by default, right? It's not that the United States was suddenly increasing defense spending. In fact, as you can see, US military spending declined over the 90s in real terms, but it's the superpower competitor went away. Now, a fair number of scholars, when they talk about the unipolar era, that is the 1990s and the early 2000s, focus on this kind of a graph almost entirely. That is the position of the US as a sole superpower, largely in military or in raw economic terms. We think it's important, if you want to understand what's happening now, to get under the hood of what the 1990s were, what the unipolar moment was, to get a sense of the mechanisms at work and the mechanisms that are now driving US hegemonic unraveling. And indeed, you can get a sense of just how, I promised everybody there'd be at least one flub. This is that flub. I hope it's only the one major one. This is, of course, a chart showing the share of world GDP controlled by the G7 as composed to, say, rising powers. And you can see that for the 1990s, the United States and its major advanced industrialized democratic allies controlled over 40% of world gross domestic product in purchasing power parity terms, which is the least favorable terms for the advanced industrialized democracies, which gives you a sense of just how much outside economic power we have. Okay, so to understand what was happening under the hood, I want to turn to another manifestation of liberal capitalist globalization that, if you arrive in the 1990s, was driving a lot of headlines, and that is the increased dominance of Walmart in small town America. Now, if you know this history, and you probably are living in its aftermath now, Walmart often drove out small businesses to the extent that it emptied the main streets of many American towns, leaving it the only game in town, literally, for the purchase of goods like food and weapons. Walmart, as you may know, used to sell guns. Now, it's not that there weren't alternatives. There was mail order and so on. You could get things. Amazon was just selling books at this point, but these were all kind of marginal. Now, imagine if it wasn't just that Walmart dominated consumer goods in your area, but it also, say, was the only source of banking and finance. Let's go further and say that it's basically basically all your goods and services are subject to Walmart's terms and choices. But let's go further. Let's imagine that Walmart is the only model of business that people see as viable and worthwhile. So the vast majority of people want to be or want to replicate what Walmart is doing. And now imagine if Walmart's greeters weren't just in the store, they were wandering around town and coming into your homes and pitching Walmart and showing you how great it is to be a Walmart customer and how you can get the most from Walmart. And indeed, some of them aren't even paid by Walmart. They're volunteers, or they work for pro-Walmart foundations and non-governmental organizations, spreading the gospel and the way of life of Walmart. Well, this semi-fictional Walmart is, of course, the United States in the 1990s. The United States had global hegemony. The unipolar moment was built on, first of all, an American and Western patronage monopoly. That is, the United States, along with its allies and the international institutions they controlled, were really the only game in town, for the most part, when it came to things like development assistance or security guarantees and other kinds of international goods. Secondly, the implosion of the Soviet Union wasn't just an implosion of a superpower, it was an implosion of its entire order, its entire alternative set of institutions and structures, which left the United States as the United States model, the Western democratic model, as the only vision of order that had truly global purchase. There were rival ones, but none of them had the prestige or the reach of the United States model. And so not only was it that states and other actors really could only go to the IMF or the World Bank or the United States or the European Union and accept their terms, their conditions for things like assistance and security guarantees. It was also that they thought that that was the bandwagon. You had to get on it. And liberalism, by and large, was sort of neoliberal economic and democratic policies really had the kind of prestige as being the way in which people thought order should be. Moreover, just like this example of greeters running wild, Western NGOs and Western transnational society activists of various sorts were kind of running rampant in the 1990s. And so if you went into post-communist space, you'd find all sorts of groups funded by US philanthropists or the US government or by Europeans who were teaching people how to do free press, were teaching people how to do democratic protest. We're engaged in this project of building a liberal democratic order. You had economic advisors, sometimes for the worse, telling states how to liberalize their economies, how to integrate into market economies, how to get themselves into a position, if you were, for example, in Eastern Europe, where you might be able to join the European Union or NATO at some point. And this meant in practice that states had no exit options. They had to accept the terms and conditions of the United States and its allies. It meant that they had no major alternative visions to look to, and a lot of states in the developing world and post-communist space their leadership thought that the only thing they could really do was to get onto the bandwagon. And it also meant that there was a transnational civil society that developed that was entirely liberal in its political characteristics. Now, all of that has reversed. There are now exit options. There are now alternatives. And there are now a wide range of illiberal anti-order movements on the rise. Fundamentally, these developments are being driven by changes in the world economy. So by now, you notice that the share of the global economy controlled by the United States and the other G7 nations is down to about a third. Meanwhile, other economic power is dispersing. This is a story both about general economic change, but also particularly about the rise of China. This change means that there is now the capacity outside of the Western democracies to engage in alternative order building and international goods provision. This is, as Alex will say, not just China. Russia's in the game, as are an increasing number of regional powers, but a lot of this is centered around China. So on the left, we see the huge number of new ties via multilateral institutions and forums that China has built since, I think this is from 2010. So China is really engaged in a huge amount of alternative order building. We have another slide like this I'm not going to show you for Russia that shows that while Russia is nowhere near as extensive in its new networks, it still has a lot of new networks that it's developed. And if you looked at this sort of slide laterally for so-called South-South interactions, you also see a densening of alternative order. Moreover, most famously, for those of you who kind of know your current worrying about China and the liberal order, you have Chinese development assistance, a lot of which has been yoked together under the rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative. And this means between China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and a host of other states, some of which are more or less aligned with the United States, some of which are not, there are a host of exit options now. So states that want international goods have leverage in these bargains. They can seek to get better deals from the United States on aid and assistance, or they can go to other actors and get aid and assistance or cooperative arrangements, say on anti-narcotics trafficking or on border protection, without those pesky Western conditions, without those pesky Western NGOs running around. It also means that states have now leverage for pursuing illiberal ends. So on the right, Alex, do you want to say a few words about these two slides?
Yeah, sure. So here on the right is the map of the pro and anti Xinjiang vote that came up in UN Human Rights Committee. So the countries in green are the countries that signed on to the critical assessment of the re-education camps in Xinjiang as a violation of the norms of human rights treaties. And then the countries in red are the countries that were mobilized by China in support, not only of the Xinjiang policy, but of China as a supporter of human rights norms and values. And so what's really remarkable about the image is that you see the core of the liberal order, Western powers. Of course, the US is no longer part of UNHCR, but you see some of the core members, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, Canada, now being outnumbered by countries in Eurasia, in Africa, and Latin America, supporting the Chinese position. And much of this might have to do with countries that have also been targeted by the BRI or received Chinese investment in public goods. But I think it is indication of some of the normative shift that's happening in these classic institutions. On the left is a slide of a gentleman named Kurmanbek Bakiev. He was the president of Kyrgyzstan for 5 years, along with then President Dmitry Medvedev. Bakiev initiated one of these interesting competitive bidding wars over the status of the US military base at Manas. This was a major military base that was used to stage troops and material into Afghanistan. The point here is that Bakiev sensed an opportunity to get better terms from the US. And so he extracted a $2 billion aid package from Russia with the promise that he would close down the base. And then savvily, or maybe not so savvily, quite crudely, he turned around, pocketed the first installment of Russian money, and then did a new deal with the US. So on the one hand, you would say, well, this proves that the US could, at the end of the day, pay more for something and sort of ensure its presence. But it also gives us an insight into the behavior of some very small states, in this particular sort of Kyrgyzstan, sensing an opening through which they can leverage alternative patronage or the threat of alternative patronage to demand better conditions and drop some of the liberal conditions, in this case, human rights criticism as well as anti-corruption criticism that had plagued his government coming from the West.
All right. So finally, as I mentioned, we have the rise of counter-order movements and indeed illiberal forces on the offensive. And these are, of course, pictures on the right or stage right on the left of right-wing populists in Europe, and then on the right we have, of course, luminaries of Brexit hanging out with Donald Trump. And indeed, we argue in the book that Trumpism itself is part of this wave of, we sometimes talk about right-wing populism as if it's just this sort of thing. We talk about what might be driving it. But in our view, it's best to understand right-wing populism as one of a number of counter-order movements that are highly mobilized, that are actually have taken over countries, that want to change or modify, for good or for ill, the international order built by the United States. And this, of course, this kind of process of counter-order movements being involved in driving hegemonic unraveling, being involved in undermining the existing dominant powers, sort of institutions and arrangements, is a very old story. So in the book, for example, we talk about examples about the role that the rise of Protestant networks played in the destabilization of the Spanish bid for hegemony in early modern Europe. We talk about interwar fascism and Bolshevism and the way that these movements helped to bring about transformations in international order. We talk about the singular importance of anti-colonial movements in ending the European imperial order. And we argue that these kinds of movements, while they might seem like a sideshow, are actually fairly critical to processes of hegemonic unraveling. Indeed, where I want to wind up is what the world looks like if we talk about a series of positive feedback loops between these mechanisms as reversing, as shifting no longer towards the maintenance of a hegemonic order or American order, in this case, but towards unraveling. Essentially, what this kind of feedback loop looks like and what we think is happening now is that when you get power transitions, this has a number of effects. That is, you get the rise of other powers, the rise of other economic actors with economies where they can do things like provide goods, et cetera, et cetera. You have a number of dynamics that kick in. One is that you get new ideological models, whether it's Chinese authoritarianism or, in Russia's case, a kind of culturally conservative model, illiberal democracy, as some people call it, or hybrid regimes. You get an increase in the number of credible goods providers, and you get, in both of these dynamics, have a couple of effects. New ideological models strengthen the argument of counter-order movements. It gives them alternatives to look to. It also gives them the sense that ideological hegemony is destabilized and there are openings for new kinds of movements. The increased number of credible goods providers undermines the patronage monopoly we've talked about, creating exit options. Ideological models, the counter-order movements sometimes take control of states. And between that and the increase in exit options, which of course also helps counter-order movements once they take control of states or in their arguments for taking control of states, you get states that successfully exit or contest ordering pressure. The more states that you get like that, the more reduction in support you have for the current contemporary international, or for the international order, and the more examples of you have to provide support or as sources of emulation for counter-order movements. And you can get this kind of positive feedback spiral. We saw examples of this, as I mentioned, in the rise of fascism during the interwar period, in which fascist successes in one country helped to trigger fascist success in other countries. It also led to building alliances against rival ideological groups. And what's particularly striking about this moment, and this is where I'll conclude on coming back to Trump as a symptom and accelerant, is that what's very unusual about this period is that one of these movements has achieved control over the executive branch of the hegemon itself. So again, whether for good or for ill, we're not trying to make an argument here politically, although we do have our own views about whether Trump foreign policy is a good thing. The United States itself has become at least partially dominated in its foreign policy by a counter-order movement, which is attempting to transform the international order along more illiberal lines, that is, with less interest in promoting human rights and multilateralism, and more interest in great power compacts and spheres of influence, and more interest in national sovereignty as a more kind of inviolable norm, at least rhetorically. and that is itself contributing now to these feedback processes in a way that we had not seen before. So
Yeah.
that's what I've got before discussion time. Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just a couple of points just to emphasize some of the Russia-related points that you made. Often we start conversations about Russia and Russian aspirations with the observation that Russia is a declining power. And I don't find that particularly helpful in terms of thinking about ordering dynamics, because power is wielded in certain environments and over sort of certain architectures. But I think pointing out these three mechanisms gives us some leverage as to what Russia is trying to do and its relative successes and failures. So for instance, in the first place, creating ordering mechanisms, you see Russia, especially in its so-called near abroad, create organizations that promote security, like the CSTO, or the Eurasian Economic Union in economics, each modeled on a kind of a mimetic way on a Western institution. You see also Russia joining China's SCO. And often the criticism of these organizations as well, either Russia is coercing these countries into joining, or that these regional organizations are just talking shop. They're not really doing anything. They're not facilitating cooperation, deep cooperation, the way we think about it. And our suggestion is, regardless of the successes or failures of these individual organizations, that the ecology of international order has really shifted. And especially in places like Central Asia and South Asia, these countries are now members and routinely interact with and plan for a number of regional summits and organizations that are led by Russia and China, right? So this makes it a very different world than the one Dan described. And Dan's last point about the Trump administration accelerating some of these feedback loops against the liberal order is why Russia is so supportive of Trump and the Trump presidency. They're not supportive because of certain bilateral things that have happened during his administration, like weapons sales to Georgia and Ukraine, or the enshrining of sanctions in US law. They're supportive of him because he does not aspire to promote or defend the liberal international order, and especially kind of the multilateral ties. The second mechanism, we see mixed success. So I mentioned Russia as an alternative patron, having some high profile failures. Being outbid at Manas was one of them. The other one was not convincing President Lukashenko of Belarus to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the Georgia War. But that in and of itself is not evidence, or not the sole evidence, of Russian ineffectiveness. That's just one dimension in which Russia has experimented with certain clients and demands. And it's actually not a very cost-effective way for them to affect the order. And then the third that Dan pointed out is by inserting itself into this battle over transnational networks, either funding European or Western political parties. One could argue the Russian interference in the 2016 election was this also attempt to sort of exacerbate these cleavages and these wedges. But also you see Russian patrons, oligarchs as big funders and players in some of these illiberal transnational movements, like the World Congress of Families, for instance. So what we see in the Russian strategy is a very broad tackling of world order, both on the level of promoting regional organizations, acting as an alternative patronage provider, and as acting a player in new illiberal transnational networks. And I think it's important to realize this kind of heterogeneous toolkit that Moscow has and the very experimental nature of what it's doing. Okay, so I'll leave it at that, and we'll hand it over to Emma for her thoughts and critiques.
Great, thanks. So thanks for having me to talk about the book today. I really enjoyed it. Actually, I particularly will say I love the Walmart example that wasn't so much in the book but was in the presentation. As an immigrant to America, I've long thought that American exceptionalism should really be defined as the fact that you can go to Walmart and buy a steak and toilet paper and a gun all in the same store, which doesn't happen anywhere else in the world as far as I'm aware. But I really enjoyed the book, and while I certainly don't agree with everything in it, I found it to be really enlightening, really theoretically useful, makes me want to go and reread Gilpin, which is actually quite a big compliment coming from me. And I think, in just sort of trying to situate the book in my own sort of mental, how I think about the field and the literature, I think it's seeking to answer two fairly big questions. So the first is that it reminds me of some of the books that we've seen recently. I think Steve Walt's The Hell of Good Intentions is probably the one that's most obvious, but there's been quite a few. And the question that they're asking is, how did we get here? How did America go from where it was in 1991 to where it is in 2020? And perhaps a little more negatively, how did we squander that lead to end up where we are today? And then the second question I think this bears on is there's been a whole wheel of works on great power competition, the rise and decline of great powers, how they contest with one another. And so the thing that I really liked about the book is that it tries to combine those two questions, right? So it takes those, it doesn't necessarily focus on the historic cases, there is that historical chapter, but it's much more about what it means for how America is approaching the world and has approached the world for the last few decades. So a couple of the things I really liked, and then I'll probably get into some criticisms. So thank you for not being all about the liberal international order and whether it exists and whether it's a real thing, because if I have to hear more about that, I might scream. But actually, I really like this idea of hegemonic orders as a different way to look at it. So the idea that the liberal international order, quote unquote, is not a unique thing, that this is what hegemons do. They try and build an international system that broadly supports their aims. And I think that's a much clearer theoretical idea for us to wrestle with. I also really appreciated you sort of being clear on the idea that there was no inevitability to America's strategic focus in the post-Cold War era. I think that's just sort of one line in the book, but it really stuck out to me. The idea that sort of we chose the approach that we did of building these transnational networks, of building these international institutions and focusing on this, and that America's choices there to some extent shaped where we are today, because that's something that I think we often overlook when talking about these issues. So the three pillars of hegemony that you talk about, to get into a little more criticism: the transnational networks, the idea that there's sort of no alternatives to American order, and that there's no other great powers. The reason that I sort of framed it that way is that I question to some extent the idea that the transnational networks, which incidentally you'll notice the transnational networks are the only one of these that is not a structural factor, right? So the idea of no alternatives, the idea of no other great powers, those are both things that the US didn't actually affect. So the transnational networks is the one thing that the US had agency on. And the reason I raise it this way is because I question the extent to which those transnational networks were actually necessarily supportive of this American-led hegemony. In the short term, certainly, but in the long term, and I know Dan and I have talked about this before, but I question the idea to whether maybe some of those networks themselves are driving the dynamics that you talk about in sort of the exit from below chapter, right? So the extent to which America's focus on pro-democracy, on fighting corruption, at least ostensibly internationally, how that kind of thing drove the fears of autocrats that ended up making them look for exits when those exits became available. So you talk about some of this in the book, but then you still talk about transnational networks as sort of a strength of American hegemony. And it almost seems to me like it wasn't a weakness when we were strong, but now that we're no longer so strong, it has become a weakness. So, you can look at a couple of other things that the US did in that way, right? We could talk about the kleptocracy argument. We could talk about how sort of transnational economic globalization, how that's driven some of the backlash that we've seen against immigration, refugees. People have talked about this a lot in the last couple of years. And then the other one I would sort of bring up is the idea that perhaps the hypocrisy of American foreign policy can be problematic when you're trying to build an order whose legitimacy derives from ideas. effectively. You know, if you're building an order that says, you know, we support democracy, we oppose, you know, the use of force to change borders. So, you know, something that you say it in the book, a lot of people say it, and I sort of always want to ask, why is Ukraine an order destroying rule violation when the Russians invaded, but Iraq isn't, and Kosovo isn't? In both of those cases, the US couldn't get permission from its international organizations, and it went and found another way. So you know, I think that that's something you might want to wrestle with a little more as if you move forward with this in other arenas. Another thought, so I love the idea, I think I said, I love the idea of international orders. I love the idea of them as ecosystems. I think that helps to move us away from this paradigm of just it's great powers and everybody else, and lets us perhaps talk a little more about how great powers interact with everybody else and how that drives power dynamics. But I question a little, you've got this 2x2 in, I think it's like the second or third chapter, where you talk about order contestation and alternative order building and strategies for doing that. And I just wonder whether order contestation, that is, you know, the idea of other countries pushing back against international institutions or structures that the hegemon has created, I wonder if that's really an alternative to alternative order building. That's a really awkward way to put it. I wonder if they're not sequential. So, you know, order contestation is step one. If you are successful, then you move to step two, which is alternative order building. And, you know, Alex talked about this a little a few minutes ago. You know, that Russia has set up a bunch of institutions. Some have been successful, some aren't. Some of the Chinese institution creating seems to be a little more successful. But I don't think you can necessarily say that the regional organizations always matter, right? So you mentioned the CSTO, but, you know, I mean, there was also, what was it, Guam, right? Georgia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Moldova, I think, which is one of those Russian security organizations that never panned out and no one really remembers what it is today. So, you know, it strikes me as if these things were sequential, right? Then that would be an attempt to order contestation that didn't work, so we never moved to step two. And I'm also not 100% sure how the wedging versus brokering argument is distinct from just balancing versus bandwagoning. So, so that's an area where I'm not quite so sure about the theoretical construct. Let me just make a couple more points because I want to leave some time for Q&A. A smaller point, I'm not so sure that George W. Bush is qualitatively different from Donald Trump. If you'd asked me at the 2006 election, I would have said, oh, they're definitely different. Actually, after having watched the last few years, I'm increasingly convinced that it's some of the same people involved, same mechanisms, withdrawing from international treaties, and all that really, the major difference is simply that in the Bush administration, there was an internal counterweight to people like John Bolton. In the Trump administration, it doesn't exist. So I think it's sort of the same trends, it's just being more successful under Bush. And then last point, you say that the key question of the Trump administration is whether you can separate power from this hegemonic system. So can the US subsist on power alone? But I would suggest that perhaps we could think about it another way, right? So if, as you say, we're already far into this process of exiting hegemony, if these trends are irreversible, this isn't something we can do anything about, perhaps it's the fact that the system wasn't good for US interests. Perhaps some of these things like those transnational networks were undermining our power position. Perhaps our security infrastructure was overextending us, bringing in too many pressures. Perhaps things like NATO expansion were basically fated to fail because they got overextended. Perhaps the US focus on human rights and democracy undermines us because it divides us from the autocrats that we might need to prop up our power system. And so I guess what I'm really saying is if I were to play devil's advocate, you know, was Steve Bannon right about Russia, as crazy as he is? Or, you know, if you were to compare, say, the US approach to Syria with the Russian approach to Syria, right? You talk in the book about how the Russians didn't actually get bogged down in Syria, so it wasn't a problem, but they didn't get bogged down because they didn't intend to build it or turn it into a democracy or engage in regime change. Trump's approach, which is just smash ISIS and get out, is functionally very similar. maybe Trump's approach is just more suitable for this sort of increasingly multipolar world. And maybe he, or the people around him, because he's crazy, but maybe the people around him are just recognizing reality and that this actually is a strategy that might work in this sort of new world order that we're moving into. And so my final very short criticism is you don't tell us what to do moving forward. You posit two potential scenarios for where we could go here. Cold War 2.0, multipolar world. They require very different strategies. And I think right now we're probably pursuing number 3, which is something entirely different than what we've always done. And so I would really like to see more about what you think we actually should do for US foreign policy. So I think I've probably talked too long. I will turn it back to Alex and would love to hear your thoughts.
Emma, that was great. Thank you so much. So I'm actually going to ask Dan to hold off on maybe some of his responses because there was so much in there to delve into. And maybe we can just field a couple of questions from around, and we can bundle some of some of our responses to your comments, Emma, in answering some of these questions. One question that we've gotten from Leah Diaz is wondering about the transatlantic relationship and the presidency. And then she talks about your opinion about conspiracy theories related to COVID in terms of hegemonic powers. And I think this opens up a broader question of how is the book's argument, and Emma, how are you thinking about the whole question of COVID and international dynamics? I think on the one hand, you could make an argument that, well, in terms of structural hegemonic power, the US financial system, dollar is king again, everyone's opening lines to sort of the Fed, this is, the time of crisis when you really see sort of US hegemonic power. But on the other hand, I think you see some other signs too about sort of posturing and emergency goods provision and so forth. So I'd love to have the two of you opine on that for a little while and then move into some other questions. Dan, do you want to take a shot at that first?
Well, I mean, I think that's a setup, right? Because we have a piece coming out in Foreign Affairs that talks a little bit about that relationship and is sort of also a t-shirt for the book. So if you want a kind of short summary of the book arguments, that's a good place to look. Fundamentally, I think the fact is that, and this actually also relates to the second question we had with from Cynthia Roberts, which is a long thing, but talks about sort of different regional orders and different issue area orders, which is that we argue quite strongly in the book that it's a mistake to talk about the international order, even if we wind up doing that as a shorthand, and that in fact international order is a kind of bricolage of different regional and issue specific orders. And there are certainly domains in which the United States exercises still tremendous hegemony. I mean, we want to be clear, the United States is still the most powerful country in the world, and it's still even in a world of kind of great power transitions, it's going to be a while before we don't talk about the United States as being first among equals among great powers, although I'll come back to that question of how sustainable that is in a bit. But so there are areas like monetary policy, dollar hegemony, where the United States just still, because of various kinds of network effects and institutional lock-in effects, and because of the underlying strength of its economy and its financial centrality in international politics, where the United States just does enormous amounts of power. But there are other areas, right, where that's not less the case. And so the big debate is, can dollar hegemony, for example, persist if other countries can do things like route around or come up with their own mechanisms for financial transactions, or the United States is no longer using threats of withdrawal of military or other kinds of economic support in order to maintain dollar hegemony. And I think we're both kind of skeptical of that, right? So we think that COVID-19, what the current pandemic does, is it highlights some of the transitions that are going on now. It also highlights places where the transitions are more advanced, say in global health provision or in the sort of breakdown of international cooperation without US leadership, and in the ability of China to provide international goods to populist regimes or in other regimes, period. It's a sort of that populist movements are very happy about trumpeting how they're providing these international goods, things like, which are largely just trade contracts they fulfilled on medical supplies and things like that, or can send experts in. But the United States still has clear advantages in some areas like global economic stabilization out of the Federal Reserve. That's how I kind of see it. I mean, the conspiracies are interesting because they're part of this ongoing propaganda war between the United States and China, which is a kind of attempt to shape the narrative, which relates to the ideological and the counter and pro-order dimension, sort of counter-order and pro-order movement dimensions of hegemonic politics. So.
Emma, do you have any thoughts on COVID and international ordering?
Well, actually, honestly, I was just going to give a plug. So Dan was nice enough to join us on a podcast. Trevor Thrall and I do this podcast called Power Problems. You can get it on iTunes. Dan joined us for an episode last week, and we actually spent about 10 minutes talking about the book and coronavirus. And so if we're running out of time today, I would suggest, if you're interested, for viewers, that's something you can go and find a little more on. I will just say one thing. We're talking about the extent to which other countries can sort of root around US sanctions, for example, the extent to which they can turn the tools of power against us. Trump is all over the place on this, because I sort of said, well, maybe his approach is just reacting to sort of these changing trends. And that is true in some cases. And then there are other cases, so like Syria, and then there's other cases where his administration has actually sort of overextended the use of US power, and sanctions is one of those. It sort of suggests perhaps that a more modest foreign policy, one that doesn't seek to necessarily change everything, might preserve those tools, might preserve things like dollar hegemony for longer. And perhaps slow the trend. So, I really like the idea that Trump is an accelerant rather than sort of just a lot of people say symptom and cause, but accelerant implies that he is making it worse actively. And it seems almost like the best we could hope for from another administration would be to slow the decline.
That's great, thanks. Next, I want to take a question from my colleague, Kimberly Martin, who writes, given the underlying strength of the US economy, banking system, and security infrastructure, if we see a post-Trump US return to a liberal democratic ideology, could we imagine a successful challenge to the emerging pro-China authoritarian order? In other words, could a less hypocritical liberal democratic US leadership reemerge as a hegemon? I love this question because this gets at, I think, just the heart of, if we had a Biden victory in 2016, where the liberal order and resurrecting it and sort of these traditional mechanisms and norms of U.S. statecraft and power were once again highlighted, would this be A, an effective counterweight to China's rise, and B, could we sort of reclaim some of this lost hegemony? And my own view on this is that I think we are in the clear decline of liberal democracy as a norm. And I think this decline dates to about 2005. And when you start looking at, I know indices have had different problems and issues, but certainly the mid-2000s is an inflection point. And it's an inflection point to get at one of Emma's sort of critiques, was that democracy stopped being viewed even by authoritarians as an irritant or as an annoyance and started to be looked at as a regime threat. And what sends them over are the color revolutions, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and that's of course compounded by the Arab Spring. And the idea that the US is just willing to throw under the bus long-term allies like Mubarak, just to respond to sort of street pressures and demonstrations, I think really pulls apart this idea that democracy sort of strengthens regime ties and sort of global, nests them into sort of secure global networks. It seemed to sort of give off, the other positive lesson. So I think until we see some sort of really, global demonstration effect to the opposite, that, you have real authoritarian failings, and that it's the sort of, democracies that show sort of competence or result. I think this slide continues. And sure, I think Biden, would probably get a bump and he would get some goodwill. But, I think these dynamics were undergoing even when Obama took power. And I think maybe we didn't appreciate that until we got to the Arab Spring. But I think, it's another one of these great sort of natural tests and stories. Next, I want to combine a couple of other questions I see. One is from Craig Charney, who's talking about perhaps there's another alternative, the collapse of order and conflict between rising and declining powers. Ian Bremmer's G0 world, if you think the closest comparison to the current crisis might be 1929-32, would such an outcome be likely? And then I want to combine that with Jim Dingman's question on how do you calculate an idea, is the question of distinguishing what we are seeing domestically in all these countries. Is this fascism or is this simply sort of a populism? So I think the two are related in the senses that what if, there is such unclarity in domestic politics that, the very question of sort of international ordering just isn't that much of a priority anymore. And in this sort of post-COVID world, this sort of national turn, to borders and national policies and so forth makes it one of an order of neglect as opposed to conscious order enhancing or order contestation. So maybe you can comment on those two parts. Dan, you want to talk a little bit about those?
I mean, I don't actually have much to add to your framing, I think. So one of our big concerns in the book is that if you look at the scholarly and popular literature on hegemonic decline and on change in international order, it mostly focuses on the idea that orders end with major power wars, right? With this kind of scenario, right? So World War II marks the final transition from British to American global order, for example, in some of this telling, or at least a competitive order of the United States and the Soviet Union. And so the conflict then is the kind of moment that washes away the old and brings in the new. And one of the things that we really want to push in the book is the idea that most of the political action surrounding international order can happen without a great power war, or historically often happens before the great power war. So that by the time you get to the great power war, the order's already been transformed or hollowed out or changed, sometimes in ways that we don't even see, but other times in dramatic ways, like the Japanese decision to tell the League of Nations to go hang out with itself and set up its own militarized alternative order building in East Asia through the co-prosperity sphere. So we're kind of interested in this idea that the politics of contestation of order are really important, and that they actually they drive some of the dynamics that might bring about the war, that bring about hegemonic decline. And this fits in nicely, I think, with the question about, so we don't think, because we think that even if China stalls out, even the United States does comparatively better, that data about shifts in relative economic capabilities, right? That things like that are that's kind of the world we live in now. Because we think that, we don't necessarily think that it's a great idea for the United States to engage on this sort of really intense liberal order building. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. That's probably self-defeating because of the existence of exit options and other capabilities. So what we're really concerned about is the degree to which the United States can maintain the infrastructure that allows it to have outsized great power capabilities. And I'm going to twist this all the way back to something that Emma said initially, where I think she pointed out rightly that on one hand, we're talking about structural factors like shifts in relative economic power, although there were choices there. The United States didn't have to engage China in the way that it did, for example. And then we move to things like transnational movements that seem very agency focused. But one of the claims that we make in the book, and I think this is a claim ironically that we share with people like John Mearsheimer, is that the period of unipolarity was not actually a period of unipolarity if you look at, in Jan Dresner, if you look at kind of economic capabilities, right? If you look at latent power, it really was latently a multipolar period. And the reason why the United States maintained hegemony is that all of the major economic powers were allies who made decisions to stay in that system and not to develop their own military capabilities, right? Not to balance against the United States. And so in many ways, the unipolar moment really was a cartel moment, right? Or a great power concert moment in which the United States was able to make policy choices that helped prevent other states, basically encourage other states to free ride in American power. And so there is a lot more kind of agency and choice in the story than the standard, like, let's add up US defense spending and treat that as a structural factor would suggest. It's the same thing with things like US banking and financial power, where we know that, as Emma suggested, the US overuses sanctions as it's doing. It can encourage other states to try to exit or build alternatives to those orders. And so I do think that there's a lot going on that the United States can kind of influence, and not at the margins, but it has to do with the character of how powerful it is in a more great power multipolar environment, who its allies are, how strong its cooperative networks are. And that's sort of different from a world in which we come in and we try again to make everybody democratic, or we try to make everybody liberal. Indeed, our main policy prescription is that the US, if it cares about things like, hypocritically and consistently, if it cares about things like democracy, human rights, anti-corruption efforts, that it just needs to show up, right? And behave like a great power and push its influence the way any other great power would, but not with the expectation that's going to win as consistently as it used to in the past, precisely because it's not the only game in town.
That's great. And Emma, I'd like to get your take, and also to throw in also Kirill Shemiev's question about NATO enlargement. Would love to get your take on this and Russian aversion to US normative hegemony. Is it really, in your view, enlargement that triggered this reactionary behavior, or are these just different processes? Would love to hear your take on that as well.
Yeah, I'm just sorry that we can't actually ask people in the audience to weigh in on this, because I would much prefer to get Kimberly Martin's take on this. She just put out an article on the question of NATO. I mean, so on NATO enlargement, I personally see that as one of these trends, whether Russia was threatened by the military expansion, as some people argue, whether it was threatened by the sort of normative expansion, the idea that countries would sort of cleave more to the US in a normative or ideological fashion. I do believe that Russia felt to some extent threatened by NATO enlargement, but that's a debate about the past. And the question that really interests me is what does that mean for the future? And again, I keep coming back to this point in your book. Your book seems to make the point that we are already effectively irreversibly far down the path out of, at the very least, a unipolar form of US hegemony. And some of that perhaps suggests primacy worked, but it only worked for so long, and that in it, with things like NATO enlargement, it contained the seeds of its own destruction. It contained factors that eventually led to the undermining of that power, because states like Russia or China wanted to push back on it. And so, for me, the interesting question, this raises just so many interesting questions. And it's how do, assuming that what is in your book is accurate, and I believe it is pretty accurate, how do we react? How do we respond to that? How do we, can we arrest the slide? Can we push back against it? Can we work to, the two futures that you suggest, is one of them more attractive than the other? And frankly, I do believe that the multipolar world is far more attractive than the bipolar US-China world that you propose. So the final question I guess it raises for me is just, how does foreign policy shift? How does the viewpoint that is held by foreign policy elites in these great powers when they're declining, how does that shift over time? And I think if we had somewhat of a better answer to that, then perhaps we might understand more about how the US could shape this going forward. That's not really so much an answer as a series of big questions, but that's what I really like about the book.
That's right, Emma, thanks so much. So I'll let Dan ponder that just for a second, and I'll give him the final word in terms of, the way forward and what would a strategy look like, in terms of a multipolar world and acting within them. I want to address just a very brief question, though, from Yvonne on this question of the ecology metaphor and how useful we find it. It's something I think that's been very helpful for us anyway, in how we think about the evolution of some of these regions. And just personally, Central Asia is a really dramatic example of that, because with the ecology metaphor, you can talk about different kinds of actors coming in, but you can also talk about their sparsity and density. So in the 1990s, Central Asia is a very sparse ecology. There are different actors there, but the processes aren't so intense as they are in the 2000s, when you have security cooperation with the US, you have these new regional international or regional organizations introduced by Russia and China, these new norms, new legal influences, they all start interacting with each other in a much denser kind of way. And so I think you see pockets of this sort of sparsity elsewhere. And, one implication of this, although we don't get into this in this book, is that these areas of sort of sparser ecologies are more vulnerable potentially to these transition dynamics and substitute patrons than other areas that are much more integrated into the core. But Dan, maybe you can take us out of here by talking about some policy recommendations, or at least some strategies for dealing in a multipolar world.
I know you want me to do that, but I want to make sure we get a couple of we try to rope in the questions we've gotten, but there are a couple that we've missed. And so I actually want to end and maybe shift on that. We had a good question about whether or not the problem isn't so much, some of the things we're talking about, but the fact that a lot of voters don't believe the current international order, current domestic order serves their interests. And I will say that there is an entire portion of the book devoted to unpacking or disaggregating the idea of the liberal order, right? And I mentioned this in passing, but one of the things that we point out very strongly is that not only is there no such thing as the liberal order in the sense of there being no overarching aggregate international order, period, in many ways, or if there is in a only very thin sense that the international order is a bricolage. But also we argue that liberal order is highly variable and involves very different configurations. And I won't run through all of that because we don't have a lot of time, but one of the things we talk about, which is something which isn't original to us, we point out, just as an example, the shift from a more kind of quote unquote embedded liberal order that was more modeled after kind of New Deal and welfare states and mixed economies to a neoliberal order in the 80s and 90s that was very much more interested in trying to protect markets from democracy and interested in marketization and privatization. And we're both on the left side of the spectrum. We think that that was a bad thing overall, or at least it went way too far. And so many of our policy recommendations at home in the United States have to do with reinvesting in US human and infrastructure capital as a way of prolonging kind of US raw capabilities. And we also, on the international level, think that one area where the United States and the European Union, if they want to cooperate, can, is in trying to push back on the ways that capital mobility and other forms of international liberal order have contributed to the oligarchization of the global political economy and have made the world safe for kleptocracy and money laundering. And so we favor a bunch of kinds of reforms domestically and internationally to make the international order serve broader interests. So we don't disagree with that at all. But we do think that it's not just a matter of kind of objectively satisfying interests. We do think that there's a lot of politics and a lot of political struggle going over how to define people's interests. And a lot of that, I think we would just point out, has this transnational character now. That we are talking about movements and actors and states and governments who support various kinds of political movements in other states that align with them, that try to put their thumbs on the scale, in some ways like the Cold War or the interwar period, and which offer themselves as models. And we do think that to see it simply as a domestic kind of thing and not to understand this transnational dimension and the way it's connected up to the emergence of alternative models, and it's connected up to relative shifts in the economy, that would be where we would probably, I think, err. And I think inter alia, I just suggested some ways, at least some specific areas where we think the United States can do to both shore up its own domestic infrastructure and to shore up its international infrastructure. So we favor, for example, doubling down on core US alliance commitments, worrying about democracy at home and among our kind of Western allies, not necessarily the kind of hubris we saw in the 90s and the 2000s of pushing regime change, of weaponizing liberalism in a way that might, that is even going to be harder to do now than it was when the US was kind of the Walmart of the world. And so we do agree with, in fact, Emma has a terrific work of her own about the ways in which the US pushed for, push towards regime change and towards really aggressive liberalization, sowed the seeds of some of the backlash against it.
Right. Well, it seems like a good time to end. Sorry, we've gone a little bit over time. I want to thank Emma for joining us today and for her great comments and careful reading of the book. I want to thank Dan. I want to thank all of you for joining us, from your various spots. And stay tuned for more Harriman Institute virtual events. And we'll give you a heads up over social media of other forthcoming book-related events. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.